So hello everyone. First of all, apology for starting a bit late. You know, like we're living technological era where technological errors are always a possibility. We are terribly sorry for that. So I'm not gonna take a lot of your time. I really wanna like give the chair the floor for the panelists. So before starting, just to introduce the event today, we're hosting this event as the MENA Initiative, Middle East and Northern African Initiative. This initiative that started in 2014 as a reaction of all the stereotypes and rumors that has been about the Middle East and its culture and its diversity. As you know, in 2014, it was a tough time in the region. It's still a tough time. So throughout this initiative, we always try to bring new panelists, new discussions, new arguments, and new people to talk about the Middle East, its diversity, and especially its people. This is not our first event with the Sana'a Center. We're so happily, this is our second event with them. We are very happy with this collaboration, despite all the obstacles that may arise. Our first event with them was about youth engagement in peace building. It was last semester, and it was one of the best events. It's one of my favorite on the personal level. So hopefully this event will also have the same expectations, met the same expectations as the one before. Today, we are talking about the humanitarian access in Yemen. So as students of international affairs and development studies, unfortunately, it is very hard for us to look in the lens of humanitarian access or humanitarian aid. We mostly used to study about the fighting parties, about the conflict parties. However, not much of info, not much of data, and not much of consideration has been given to the civilians, to the victims of those conflicts. So we're happy today going to listen to our panelists to learn more about the humanitarian crisis that unfortunately Yemen has been passing by. As you know, Yemen unfortunately has been passing by one of the biggest humanitarian crises in human history, with famine there, with a lot of casualties and a lot of unfortunate circumstances that are affecting its people. So I'm not gonna take more of your time. I'm gonna give the floor to the panelists, and just two remarks before we start. First one is that this meeting has been recorded with the approval of the panelists. And secondly, in case anyone has any questions, especially online attendees, please feel free to write it down in the chat and we're gonna transmit it to the panelists. Third one, which is also very important, I'm sorry to interrupt you with this, that the Institute imposed on us that all attendees of this event should have their mask on because it is obligatory in the Institute's promises, except if you are being the panelist. I'm sorry for disturbing for this. Hopefully very soon we will get off those measures. So thank you so much. The floor is for panelists.
Thank you, Mohammed, for this great introduction, and thank you to the MENA Initiative for hosting this event. My name is Emanuel Schäublin. I will be your facilitator today. And first of all, I would like to excuse to the people on Zoom for being late and for the technical hiccups. We hope it's going to run smoothly from now on. So I would like to welcome you in the name of the Sana'a Center Geneva, and also, I guess, in the name of the Sana'a Center. I will briefly explain afterwards the difference between the two. I'd like to thank also the Graduate Institute for hosting this event and for offering this wonderful location. And finally, thanks to the FDFA, the Swiss Foreign Office, for supporting the production of this report, which we will present today. It's a report that examines the humanitarian aid to Yemen over the past years. And it was published by the Sana'a Center a few days ago, and we will take this as an opportunity to really discuss the main messages and the outcomes of this report. So briefly, a word on the Sana'a Center Geneva, which was established in May 2018 as a sister institution to the Sana'a Center in Sanaa, which is based in Geneva. And the idea was at the beginning to provide logistical support to the Sana'a Center in Yemen. But then as we started working on this, we realized actually that the Sana'a Center has a kind of a model character, because it is a locally grounded think tank that produces knowledge on the ongoing conflict in the country of Yemen. And the model is successful to the extent that it works with a lot of local researchers who speak the language very well and have very good access. And it combines this work of these local researchers with internationals who support the editing of the results and create a kind of a space where this kind of local knowledge can better resonate in international debates. So we think that the effect of this is better public information, be it on the international level or in the local kind of Yemeni context, that allows for holding international and national actors better accountable for their actions. The Sana'a Center Geneva was therefore established with the aim of supporting the Sana'a Center and also to explore whether the model that the Sana'a Center has created could also inspire similar projects, similar think tanks in other conflict countries around the world. And in this endeavor, we consider Geneva as an excellent place for networking and providing logistical support for such locally grounded knowledge production in conflict zones, which we are convinced is deeply needed. And now I'd like to hand over to the representative of the Swiss Foreign Office, Simon Troller-Alderisi, who is from the Swiss Development Corporation, and I think currently in charge of the Yemen file.
Well, thank you very much for an introduction, and also thank you for the opportunity to say a few introductory remarks. First of all, also thanks to the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies and the Graduate Institute for organizing today's discussion, and especially also for presenting the findings of the study on the humanitarian response in Yemen, which I understand was not an easy task to do this research. I will keep myself short, since we're here primarily to listen to the findings and discuss also possible ways forward. But since we, the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, we supported the Sana'a Center in doing the study, you might ask yourself, why on earth did we finance a study that in the end criticizes our own engagement and that of the rest of the international community and the way we and them provide humanitarian aid in Yemen? Well, it's a longer answer, but I try to partly, at least, answer it. So I presume that all of us who are engaged directly or indirectly in the humanitarian response in Yemen, we would agree that the context is difficult. It's highly complex. It's a context that is politically fragmented. It's a context that is characterized by various forms of restrictions, interferences, and impediments when it comes to the delivery of aid. It's also a context that is a mix of acute crises, of ongoing armed conflict, and of underlying development challenges that have existed for many years, if not decades. Everything at the same time. And now you add to this the data challenge, or in other words, the gaps when it comes to comprehensive and reliable figures on humanitarian needs, which is also detailed very well in the study. The absence of donors, including us, in the country who support the response, a high staff turnover, and a securitized environment that provides limited opportunities for aid workers to move around and get in contact with the population they want to serve. So it's not a surprise that delivering an effective humanitarian response under these circumstances is not just a challenge, but it will most likely also put humanitarian agencies and aid workers in front of difficult choices and possible dilemmas, I think, which is all coming out of the study as well. So, and many findings and the analyses that are contained in the study, they resonate very much with our own readings of the context and of our own engagement. But we might not necessarily agree with all the conclusions that are made, but we would certainly agree with the statement that there's room for improvement. And this also then answers the question that I put up at the beginning, why we contributed to the development of the study. I think we need to take a critical look at how we best respond in a context like Yemen, with all the complexities that I have outlined, and that there certainly are more than that as well. we need outside voices, and in particular, we need Yemeni voices who can put our engagement into perspective and who can also give us input on how to do better or how to do differently, and who can also provide a voice to the Yemeni people. And I think we need also to reflect where we do well, where we do not so well, and we need to adjust accordingly. And the findings that will be presented today are certainly an important contribution towards that discussion and towards the reflection and an adjustment process. I want to conclude my remarks here and congratulate the Sana'a Center again for publishing and for completing this important research. And I really look forward to also hearing the discussion on it. So thank you.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I think without further ado, we should move on to our main panel. And I would like to introduce the speakers. With me is Sana'a Vuylsteke. She's author of the report and an aid worker with a long-standing experience. She has been working across very different contexts, among which are Yemen, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, Sierra Leone, and I think yet others. And with me is also Farea Al-Muslimi, who's chairman and co-founder of the Sana'a Center and has recently completed or come back from a field trip or just from a journey across Yemen, and sort of has been there very recently. So if you would like to ask some questions about kind of contemporary ongoing developments in Yemen, he would also be happy to react to this based on his recent visit. But it's a great pleasure to now hand over the word to Sarah and listen to her presentation, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone. I just want to say thank you for being here today. Also, thank you to those who are on the Zoom call. But before starting my presentation, I would also really like to thank the Sana'a Center. As a mid-level humanitarian aid worker, it's very rare to be offered an opportunity to have your voice heard by humanitarian leadership and really by a wider audience. It's even rarer to be given the opportunity to do so in a manner which is very direct and unfiltered and doesn't have to, prioritize diplomacy over humanitarianism, and which is something that is very rare in our sector. The Sana'a Center has given not only me, but also 73 aid workers, Yemenis, civil society representatives, and even donors the opportunity to have their voices heard with regards to the humanitarian response in Yemen, its challenges, and its failings. The past week since the release of the report has seen a multitude of messages from people just like me, working in the humanitarian aid sector across the globe, in Yemen, outside of Yemen, reaching out to say how happy they are to see that the issues are finally raised publicly that we talk about internally so often. Even if some of the conclusions are difficult to hear, the findings of these reports, the series of reports, are very widely endorsed and supported by many. So on behalf of those people, aid workers in and out of Yemen, I really want to say thank you for giving us this platform. It takes on average 3 days to die of thirst, 14 to starve. In Yemen, it takes on average 10 days, and often longer, to reach any given location or to roll out humanitarian or a life-saving response, if we manage to do so at all. Humanitarian aid always tries to reach those who are most vulnerable: women, children, elderly, disabled, those who are most affected by conflict. In Yemen, if you belong to any of these groups, you are the least likely to receive aid. Why is this the case? Yemen is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. It is one step away from the brink of famine. It's the most dangerous country in the Middle East. The humanitarian operation faces immense challenges and is grossly underfunded. 19 million people are hard to reach. Authorities interfere and restrict our activities on a daily basis. This is the prevailing narrative of the Yemen response. But while this is the public side of the story, there is also another side, one that doesn't get discussed publicly often and rarely makes it into the news. This is a story about the failure of the humanitarian system to deliver at scale and how it may be contributing to the continuation of the conflict, blurring the lines between international assistance and contributing to war profiteering. The humanitarian operation is difficult to fathom when you describe it out loud. Many aspects are incomprehensible and would be strongly condemned elsewhere. One person I spoke to even called it sociopathic. I certainly have seen no other humanitarian operation like it. Yet somehow the deepest and most obvious flaws have been lost within the operation, accepted due to incompetence, carelessness, or self-interest. The Houthi movement in Yemen is without a doubt ideologically extreme. It is one of the most oppressive groups the world has seen. It is a party of one of the world's most brutal conflicts. It is a perpetrator of gross human rights violations, including executions and torture. It is also our largest implementing partner. Every day in Yemen, we entrust an organization that has every motivation to disrupt principled humanitarian assistance with carrying out principled humanitarian assistance. We even pay them for it. As a result, no humanitarian can really say where aid ends up in Yemen. How far we have strayed from a principled response can be seen through the example of Durrani city. Durrani city is a small town on the west coast in Yemen, which has been held by Houthi forces since the start of the war. Most residents already fled in 2018 before an offensive that saw the town surrounded by coalition forces. By 2019, only a handful of civilians remained, I would say about 100 at most. Their neighbors, Houthi fighters, and a few prisoners of war. Also in 2019, the UN began to receive immense pressure from Houthi authorities to bring food, medical aid, and emergency supplies to the location. Voices of concern were raised and objections were lodged. How could we ensure that supplies would reach civilians? How would we protect them from being targeted and aid from being appropriated? Was it not clear that the pressure and demands would go to benefit fighters, combatants? All concerns fell on deaf ears. A WFP official at the time, when confronted with the question as to whom to benefit from the assistance, stated, "Of course I know that the so-called families inside are military. We're going to do it anyway." Assistance, predominantly food, was delivered for almost 2,000 people, and a few months later, another 3-month supply was given. This assistance likely sustained Houthi troops for months through the autumn of 2019, with the full acknowledgement of the UN. It was even hailed as a success story at the time. There are almost certainly major humanitarian needs in Yemen. They are likely large. I am not here to say that there are no needs in Yemen. But if you ask me whether the humanitarian situation is as bad as the operation claims, worse, or even half as bad, I honestly cannot tell you. There are claims that should and need to be refuted. For example, despite continued claims of famine, Yemen has reportedly seen an improvement in food security in the last couple of years. Malnutrition figures are apparently not worse or even better than they were pre-conflict. But regardless, in reality, all the data and information that we have is suspect. With a limited presence of aid workers and an inability or unwillingness to be present in a lot of parts of the country, we have turned to the perpetrators of this war, and we have asked them to somehow provide neutral and unbiased information. We have asked authorities and national organizations in one of the poorest and most remote parts of the world to assume the responsibilities for collecting and analyzing data that would normally be reserved for the most well-resourced and experienced humanitarian professionals. We rely on phone surveys in a country where most don't have a telephone and many areas don't have network. As a result, what data, if it exists at all, is unreliable. And without data, we don't know how many people need assistance. We don't know what kind of assistance they need. We don't know if the assistance that we have given them has reached them, and we don't know whether they will continue to need that assistance. Without reliable data, we don't really know anything. This lack of knowledge is perpetuated by how we as internationals conduct our presence in Yemen. Yemen is ostensibly referred to by the UN security system as one of the most dangerous places in the Middle East. As a result, some of the most stringent security rules apply to us being in Yemen. Movements can't take place unless in an armored vehicle. International aid workers are confined to comfortable compounds with apartments, restaurants, a gym, a pool, room service. These compounds are guarded by heavily armed guards in Sanaa with sharpshooters on the walls. Any movement to the field is disincentivized through the imposition of bureaucratic hurdles and requirements for authorizations from not just the authorities, but also from the coalition. From the highest levels of the UN in Rome, Geneva, New York, any mission in Yemen, even if it's urgent, takes at least a week, if not two, to be approved. This setup is considered one of the key impediments to the response in Yemen. And as a result, most of us rarely move beyond the walls of our compounds in Sanaa and Aden, completely removed from those that need our help. As one key informant I spoke to put it, aid workers in Yemen live an entirely sanitized existence, separated from the war, the hunger, and the suffering. In fact, separated from Yemen. Behind the walls of the UN compound in Sanaa, with its restaurants, swimming pool, room service, air conditioning, and gyms, suffering, need, and response have become an abstraction. It has lost a sense of urgency, purpose, and even morality. International aid workers indeed are very disconnected from the realities of Yemen. The best example to illustrate the extent of the problem can be described through Marib. Though Marib is now a daily headline in Yemen news and hosts a sizable cohort of aid workers now in 2021, for almost 4 years until 2019, the humanitarian response did not really realize that there were almost 1 million displaced people in Marib. It has taken another 2 years to establish any form of reasonable presence and response. There is something dreadfully wrong with this model. Our lack of presence in the field is often blamed on the risks it would pose to us. But is this really accurate? Representation of risk by UN security officials has often been proven to be false, debunked by research and analysis. INGOs move around Yemen without coming to harm. Yemenis go about their day-to-day lives without high numbers of casualties. And unlike Yemenis, we have armed vehicles. We have helmets and body armor. We carry medical equipment, we have security officers, and we can communicate by radio and satellite. We have aircraft that can pick us up if we are sick or if we get hurt. And even then, we are barely willing to visit their country. When we do, I often struggle to imagine what it must look like to an ordinary Yemeni citizen. Lines of bright white air-conditioned vehicles. Often, if you are the UN, bookended by heavily armed technicals from one of the warring parties. A few minutes and a handful of questions at the most, if that, before rapidly disappearing in a cloud of dust, back to the capital, not to be seen again for months, years, or perhaps ever again. It will come as no surprise that the opinion of ordinary Yemenis of us and of the aid response is low. The problem is that it does not have to be this way. The 2016-17 Battle of Mosul, for example, was described by the US Army as the most intense urban combat since the Second World War. Despite this and the real risk humanitarian aid workers face to deliver aid in the setting, a shared commitment by aid workers and the UN security system, leadership and donors to deliver led to daily missions to the front line for months with only 24 to 48 hours notice per mission. Trauma response was set up close to the front lines. If we can do this in Iraq and in other places like South Sudan and Afghanistan, we really should be able to do this in Yemen as well. The response often references access constraints as its main impediment. And it's true, there are genuine access impediments to access in Yemen, or impediments to access in Yemen. In the north, the authorities have enforced an almost totalitarian system to control aid worker movements, to which we have almost willingly succumbed and complied without barely a word said in resistance. Instead, we have used those who have created the restrictions to collect our data and implement our response as a solution for the problem they have created. This really does not incentivize change. In the south, the greatest impediment to humanitarian access are humanitarians themselves and the security systems that ostensibly keep us from harm. Instead of pushing back against the authorities that have interfered and diverted assistance, or pushing the system to become more efficient and flexible, the humanitarian operation has instead taken a hard line against transparency and accountability, which are at the center of any functional humanitarian response. Accountability from the donor to the taxpayer, humanitarian organizations to donors, and to those it serves. The humanitarian system has always worked best when there has also been mutual accountability, where a joint presence of different components of the system, the UN, NGOs, donors, and others, have rubbed shoulders while trying to deliver aid. When we are all actually present, it is very difficult to pretend that food has been delivered when it hasn't, or that health centers are functioning when they are not. In most humanitarian operations around the world, this system and this model is severely eroded. In Yemen, it barely exists. Each sector and actor increasingly operates in silos, avoiding questions about delivery and presence. The lack of data and the uncertainty over delivery has led to a hyper-defensiveness amongst many actors, reducing transparency to an almost endangered state. All this could be overcome by good leadership. Leadership in the humanitarian system is essential. It's needed to ensure that we are well coordinated, that we are able to stand together and counter attempts to control us through the divide and rule approach. It is needed to ensure that red lines are set and unacceptable behavior is corrected, either by authorities, parties to the conflict, or aid workers themselves. It is needed to protect staff, ensure adherence to humanitarian principles, and to deliver the best response possible. There is little evidence over the last 6 years of the humanitarian response of effective humanitarian leadership in Yemen at either a national, subnational, or international level. Some have tried, but have quickly found out that we are often our own worst enemy, with internal competition and a lack of solidarity undermining even the most well-intentioned. As one humanitarian official told me, the Houthis are bad enough, but we are just as damaging to ourselves, if not worse. As several people have learned, trying to advocate for change, for a better response, or even just to defend humanitarian principles comes at a political cost. It is easier to look the other way. So where do we go from here? Some would say, if things are so bad, then why fund the response in Yemen at all? But let me be clear, this is not what this report or the series of reports advocates for. That would be unconscionable. But we do have to do better. Yemen is the second most funded response globally. With those resources, aid needs to be of a higher quality. It needs to be more principled. It needs to be appropriate. It needs to be faster, and it needs to be more accountable. We all know the root causes of the Yemen humanitarian crisis. They are not a secret. But then we should also stop pretending that handing out more food baskets or temporary shelter kits are a solution, or that it is what people want. A wise person told me there is no success without failure. In Yemen, we have been too afraid to admit failure to be able to succeed. We are 7 years into the response, and they say that late is better than never, but now is really the time. And there is an opportunity now for this. There is a formal review of the Yemen humanitarian operation at the moment, which is due to finish by the end of the year. It's an opportunity for the response to really evaluate itself, how to move forward and how to do better. Continuing the status quo cannot be an option. Yemen and Yemenis deserve better than that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for this presentation that I think, you know, triggers a lot of thinking and also I think critical thinking that is very much needed. So I would like to hand over to Farea, but sorry.
Do you want to reflect yourself before that as we initiate?
No, I think I will share some reflections afterwards, but I would like to hand over to you, and I have some questions actually, Farea.
Sure.
I mean, feel free to also add things that are not covered by how I raised the question, but it really struck me in the beginning when you were introducing the kind of the common narrative that circulates in on an international level about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. So I'd like to ask you, Farea, how does that kind of what happens in you when you hear this, and what does that kind of, you know, from a Yemeni perspective, how is this perceived? This kind of narrative that is told about Yemen as this country who goes, you know, through famine, as the worst humanitarian crisis, is, you know, desperately needs the support of the international community. That would be one question. And then the other question is, like, given what we heard, you know, how do you say should maybe some of the aid not be stopped nonetheless, or you know, why continue if the system looks so broken in a way?
I will come back to the question. I do want to say a few points before that. If you give me 4 minutes, I promise, not more. I will not try to add into the report because Sarah has done an excellent job presenting it. But I do want to highlight four points before I try to answer your question, Emanuel. Before that, I do want to again thank the Middle East Initiative student and also Sarah for doing this work, but a lot of people also who are not in this room who worked very hard to make this report come into reality, whether the translators or the graphs or the editors, specifically Suzanne Severlid, who has worked extremely for long days and nights editing this report. I do want to thank all of these, and absolutely I do want to thank the Swiss for a pretty applaudable and respectful risk by supporting Sana'a Center. I know it did come out as a surprise, and I hope not many people at least regret it. I know you support the work we do, so thank you for that. Let me say four quick points on policy dialogue. The way we look into this report at Sana'a Center is this is a chance for a policy dialogue. That level of conversation has not yet happened. Everyone has been hush-hushing to each other, whether the donors or the agencies or the local organizations. And we look to this as an opportunity, and we are committed to starting that conversation. This hopefully will be the kickoff, but we will do more than that. Second, this report also highlights something we always have been fighting, whether it comes with aid or it comes with economy or with politics, and it is the fact that there is no clear data from Yemen. And that is something it's important to try to invest more time and on that work, which hopefully more research in that decision. Three, and I want to make this very clear to those specifically on Zoom, especially all the aid workers from across the world and in Yemen or in different capitals who are working hard with the best possible intentions to try to make things better in Yemen and to help the Yemeni people. I know there are a lot of these people across Yemen and across the globe, and I know some of them personally. And I do want to say there is nothing and no much can ever honor their efforts, except by saying we will pass this forward. However, and to all of these people, we're not after you. But to countries who think that they can get away with wars and armed deals by sending some aid every now and then, we will not let you get away with that narrative. We will stand as much as we can with that. There is only one solution in Yemen. And that solution means end this war and stop being part of it. You cannot send the baskets of foods and send at the same time hundreds of billions of dollars of guns worth into a country. And you cannot do that and possibly expect to go to bed feeling better about yourself and being able to hug your children. You're a criminal when you do that, just like anyone who kills in the ground. There is no difference. To those who divert aid, there is only one thing that upsets me from those who, more than those who divert aid, it's those who also allow it to happen, or who complicit with it. To those and to all of those who divert aid in the ground, you have the research, the editorial, the researchers, and my word that we will go after you and we will find you. And we will do what we are able always to do, research and publish you, wherever you are in the world. It is beyond upsetting as a Yemeni to understand and to notice that there are people who are angry, there are people who are hungry, and there are people who are complicit, misusing this aid, whether in the ground or by bad decision-making happening all across. What to do about it? That's my fourth point, what we ask the humanitarians to do. Same thing we did when we published this report, which was going through months and months and weeks and days of one simple question, which is, are we doing more harm than good? That's not a lot to ask the aid organizations to think. That's the most basic rule of humanitarian aid. That is something we asked them when we published and worked in this report. Our main question has always been, are we giving donors a pass? Are we giving international responsibility a pass? The answer is a very big and clear no. That is not the plan, and those who wants to use it for that reason, they are wrong. That's what we ask and what we hope NGOs will think of, and the UN agencies overall, is to think more of the question we had to go through. Are we doing more harm than good? To their defense, I also want to make my last and fifth point, which is today Sana'a has one embassy, that's called the Iranian embassy. There is no other international diplomats in Sana'a or embassies. The absence of donors in Sana'a and the isolation of that in the ground have left everyone, not just aid organizations, hostage to the Houthis' criminal and brutal attitude and behaviors. And that goes in a different levels across Yemen in a different one. It is unbelievable today that there are a lot of countries who send a lot of money to Yemen and just expect things to be fixed or expect that to be worked. That is something we definitely can do better. Now, let me go back to your question, Emanuel, and I'll try to end that in 30 seconds. And probably the second one I feel I have already answered, and should we stop this? The question is again, or the answer is again, a hell no. We need to think of how we make this framework better. That's one way. The other most important thing is aid organizations or donors or all type of development aid. There is nothing that can replace state institutions and domestic local mechanisms. Whether donors and aid organizations are in the business of weakening and replacing the Yemeni state institutions is their call. But they should not do that, and rather on the long term, there is no one who should be more in a hurry or on a patient more than a humanitarian worker. Because in an ideal world, they will actually have no jobs on the long term. And we should never forget that ever in the longer term of thinking. What is a problem with that narrative? I think it goes back to a lot of things in a way. I don't want to speak much how much it humiliates the Yemenis, but also it's an easy narrative that is presented as a victim. But beyond that, I think what happens with that, and I will end with this small example I know from Nicholas Kristof, very famous New York Times correspondent. I once emailed him, there was a trip to Yemen. I said, do you want to go to Yemen? There is a chance for journalists. And I still have that email on my email. And he responded back, he's like, oh, if it's to areas where there are starving kids, yes, I will go. The paper and myself, and I'm saying this on the record, and I know people are watching globally. He said that literally, if there are starving kids, I will go and take photos of that. The entire world, even media, was looking for a story of a very specific framing of a hungry kid from Yemen. That's the worldview they had about Yemen, and that's the worldview everyone wanted to approve. And there is a problem with that. And I will end there. It's Yemen crisis is not a haram crisis. Yemen crisis is back off crisis. It's not something happened, natural disaster, and something happened and these people went into hunger. Yemen crisis is there because there are countries and there are domestic, regional, and international players who decided to launch a war in Yemen and continue to do so. And therefore, that's what I find the worst framing about this kind of ya haram framing of the Yemen narrative. And I think that's probably what this overall framing does to the Yemeni war in overall. I'll come back if there is any questions later on, but thank you again, Sarah, for all the good work, and over to you back, Emanuel. Thank you.
Thanks. So before we get into the discussion, Farah kindly asked me to do what I sometimes do, which is do a little bit of a step back and look at this from a slightly kind of, I would say like an academic perspective. I am personally a trained anthropologist, so I'd like to share just a few thoughts with you before we delve back into the more political dimensions of discussing this report. Now, in anthropology, there's a long argument. I'm just picking this up because you mentioned this several times. Yeah, this is a ya haram crisis. You know, ya haram crisis in the sense of like, oh, you know, like we should be compassionate. There are these poor Yemenis, you know, cut off from food, and you know, this should have the impulse of compassion. We should go there and deliver this aid, or the international community should go there. But then when we look closely, this kind of impulse of compassion actually also creates these bunkers, these walls, these compounds from behind which the humanitarian aid is implemented, and it actually prevents face-to-face interaction. It prevents personal relations. And if anthropology and the history of kind of of studying the obligation that any society has to look after people in need, the direct kind of relation and interaction with the people who are in need plays a very important role, and I would even argue underpins the social contract and the obligation to look after people in need. And I find it fascinating that in a kind of from an Islamic perspective, there is this obligation to give to people in need is framed as zakah or sadaqah, and there's this idea that giving zakah or sadaqah is actually, it's not a matter of compassion. It's not a haram story, but it's a story of this money or this share of money. It belongs to the person in need. It's al-haq al-faqir. So it's a matter of giving the rightful share to that person, or it's a matter of justice. I mean, you can go in very different ethical traditions. You know, you can consider humanitarianism as an ethical tradition, the Christianity, Buddhism, and so forth. There's a lot of different ways of framing this, but I think that this is a matter of justice, and this justice actually arises from direct encounters. It arises from the fact that you're saying hi to one another with your neighbors, and you meet people and you see people, and I think that is why it's so disturbing to read this report and to realize that there are these principles of humanitarian work, humanity, neutrality. Also, I would say justice, which is a kind of that there should be a basic limit to which people are entitled when it comes to their bodily and basic mental needs. But then this kind of stands in contrast to this, to the actually embodied practice, where we hear that this aid is at the same time implemented with an increasing amount of paperwork and bureaucracy. I find it quite disturbing to read that the triple nexus approach actually very much adds even more bureaucracy onto already existing bureaucracy. And that a lot of this work is carried out from within compounds where people move around with military escorts, which then leads to actually preventing kind of social relations across that field. And it kind of takes humanitarian workers out of this context. And it does a lot of othering. The people who are living outside of the compounds are in this kind of other world, and the people in the compounds are others. So they, it maximizes this kind of mutual othering, which is something that in academia or even politically, something I think we should try to overcome. So that's I think to me really one of the most disturbing insights from reading this report. Now, when it comes to accountability, and I will finish with this, when it comes to accountability, I think there's a big disconnect between an understanding of accountability that is based on kind of bureaucratic procedures, project cycles, reporting, Excel sheets, time frames, and a context like Yemen, where you have a lot of people who don't write. It's not a context that has a kind of public press like Switzerland, where every minor misstep of a politician, when it gets picked up in the press, leads to a kind of written press scandal. But it's very much a public sphere that operates on an oral culture, on like, you know, gossip, local talk, reputations. You need to have a good reputation if you want to accomplish anything in Yemen, and this gossip and this local talk can ruin your reputation. But it seems like that this accountability through gossip and through talk and this oral culture in Yemen is totally disconnected from this accountability through these bureaucratic mechanisms. So now I don't have a solution, because I'm mainly, you know, given that I'm now taking a more academic hat, I'm mainly like interested in stepping back and just saying there is this disconnect. I don't know what to do about it, but maybe we can come back to this. So this was it for the little academic interlude on this panel, and I will now come back with 2 starting questions to get the discussion going, and then I will open the floor to everybody in here, and also to people on Zoom. You can write to me on the chat. Please tell me your name and professional affiliation, and then just write the question, and I will read it out loud later. But first, I would like to raise a question or ask a question to Sarah. To what extent does this case study of aid to Yemen actually illustrate shortcomings that we could sort of also observe in other contexts? To what extent is this Yemen case unique, you know, or think about South Sudan or Afghanistan? Are we there not really confronted with a very similar situation? So.
It's actually something that was brought up to me by quite a few people who I spoke to in the course of their research, where a lot of them would say, you know, I know that we're discussing this problem in relation to Yemen, but this is actually a global problem because we see this kind of across the board. And I think there's a couple of things. And one, which kind of leads to everything else, is this increasing incredible disconnect and bunkerization, I guess, as we call it, between humanitarian aid workers and the people, the communities that we serve or are supposed to serve, etc. I think very much increasingly, of course, not helped by COVID, we have moved into what is, you know, much more of a remote management of doing humanitarian aid. And that, of course, has several implications. I think what I said about accountability in my speech at the end is something that across the board we are beginning to struggle with, because you used to be in the field all the time, no? And you would be there, WFP would be giving food, and then you had other NGOs doing other activities, and donors would come by on a regular basis, coordinators would be present all the time. So you had like a mutual accountability towards each other, because if WFP wasn't delivering, another organization could call them out on it and be like, listen, you said you were going to do this, you haven't done it, why haven't you done it? So you really got this push, and it felt much more like a community to kind of like deliver. And across the board, we really see that this presence doesn't really exist anymore. I think increasingly what we are also really seeing across the board is this increasing struggle with securitization within the humanitarian aid process, where security becomes all important. And even though we say, you know, we're going to stay and deliver, the security, the way the bureaucracy around this, the way the security is set up, really doesn't lend itself to this. And we see more and more that choices are being made to protect and deter and impede the ability to be in the field above anything else. And I think a lot of the mistakes that we have seen in Yemen are also seen in other contexts. No, we talk about armed escorts, and it's a discussion that's happening in Afghanistan right now as well. You know, UN security officers will tell you, oh, you need an armed escort because if you go without, it's going to be too dangerous. We need to be able to protect you in case something goes wrong. But the other side of that story is that very often those people that are your security escorts are part of the conflict or are targeted by other people. So then therefore, let's say, for example, right now in Afghanistan, if you are the Taliban and you're being targeted by ISIS, but the UN security system asks you to, you know, have an escort from the Taliban, If ISIS then targets Taliban, you as a humanitarian are going to become collateral damage. So it actually puts you more at risk. So we really kind of see this whole security framework and these restrictions and these impositions growing throughout the sector. And I think lastly, and it goes again back to presence, I guess presence is one of the main things that comes up as something that is becoming more remote, is access. We talk a lot about access to communities, access to do humanitarian aid or their access to us, but very much increasingly, I think through most operations, we see access as a more reporting bureaucratic thing. We talk a lot about access impediments, we report access impediments, but at the same time, we kind of become a bystander because whilst we record the impediments, we don't actually do very much about them. And I think that is something that we see across the board in multiple contexts, not just in Yemen.
Thank you. So one question, this is the last question from me today, but one question to you, Farea. So just to come back to the title kind of suggests that if there is a new narrative or a different way of sort of telling the story of what is happening in Yemen and why Yemen needs aid and what kind of aid it needs, that this could sort of lead to a more effective humanitarian practice. Do you think that's the case? And if so, how should this narrative come about? Who should produce it? And what might it, what could it look like?
I don't know who should produce it, but definitely not a war party like happening right now. Most of the mechanisms in which data and narrative is produced is either a narrative of the Houthis or there is an attack or an aggression on the country, or the other way around of the coalition, which is we're helping Yemen by bombing it. There is a narrative being decided mostly by both sides. And I think walking out of that, whether directly or directly, what does that mean? Like UN Security Council, for example, is a framework of a war of a framework of a narrative of a war that is sponsored by the coalition. Similarly, when you can say pretty much the same thing about NGOs and the other side, their framework most of the time and their narratives is highly influenced by that for a reason or another, by way or another. So that data is definitely rigged in the narrative in that sense. And that I think is a problem. But I did wanted to say last thing on the accountability and on that, because I love this, we spoke about it many times in the past, about the armored car metaphor of an example. Let's talk about this, how much this is a problematic. First of all, you have around $2,000 worth of a car a day, right? A rent of this car. Between 1,000 and 2,000, depends. Second, this car is usually owned either by one of this militia or that militia. Third, this car is actually looted by this militia from another militia in the past. And it goes into a level of just, and fourth, there was no one who had been killed by a sniper in Sana'a the last, 5 years or 6 years when you think about it and the need of that. And then finally, I'm like, who's on earth and heavens so has some godly knowledge that no one of the 28 million Yemenis inside the country don't have, to the point you will bring them and cost $60,000 a month, like a 10 probably most brilliant country, people in the country will cost less than 2 wheels of this car, less than 2 wheels by end of every month. So you have a framework in which you cannot in the usual way hold it accountable. And it's somehow striking and upsetting, but also not surprising from a domestic point of view, that we usually, all the accountability lectures is upside down. It's NGOs who are talking to us and lecturing us about accountability. And today it's the domestic frameworks that are actually calling this out. Isn't there something, even accountability of hypocrisy that goes into that by the end of the year? You have this so much well-funded, this so much well-supported, and so much well internationally recognized the frameworks that are unable to have their own internal accountability systems. In an ideal world, this report should not have been done by Sana'a Center. This report should have been done by the United Nations agencies. Internally, should have been done by NGOs. There should have been mechanisms and frameworks within donors and within NGOs themselves that actually by the end of the day, help them really say what they're doing, they want to say, or achieve what they are wanting to say in matter of humanitarianism or in matter of any sort of an intervention into the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Farea. So with this, I would like to open the floor. Do we have a microphone in here? Do we need a microphone? Okay.
We actually don't need the microphone, so everybody can just speak. A normal voice would work. These microphones are one of the strongest we have at the Institute.
Okay, excellent. So in this case, please, we will start with the people who are physically present. It's a great pleasure to me to actually be in a physical space. So does anybody have a question? Yes, we have first Yves, and then we have I see 3 questions. So we have first Yves, and then you all the way in the back, and then you with the glasses. But first.
Great, thank you, Sanaa. Thank you very much. Great. I didn't have the chance to read the report, so I don't know. I hope you have the chance to see that now. I have one question. As we know, humanitarian organization is not something like a system, right? We know it's an ecosystem. I'll call it like that. I'm interested to know. You didn't speak so much about within organization. What is happening with the locally hired people? I really would like to know that. What happens with, in fact, you talk a lot about international humanitarian worker being somewhat, in their compound, and I totally see that. I'm interested to know not so much about local partner. I know exactly what happens to local partner. I'm really interested to know what happens within organization with locally hired people, people who played a big role. What has happened over time, and how do you see their role, if any, and how are they playing in this complex power dynamic? Thank you.
Oh, complex question. I mean, first of all, I think, national staff worldwide, no matter what organization you work for, with the turnover of international staff, national staff are, the institutional memory of any organization. They're very important, if not the most important staff that, you can have. When you say, I'm just trying to understand your question. When you say what happens to them in terms of how they see things,
I'm interested. Your perspective, at least what I've heard from you, was a very, very focus on, let's say, decision-making international staff. That's my feeling, at least, right? Yep. Completely detached from reality. That's clear. But an organization is not only with international staff, and I want to know what is happening, not with the partner. I really insist what is happening. I'm coming from a former Red Cross, ICRC, so I spent a lot of time, and I know rather well what is the power dynamic within an organization. I want to know a little bit more. Have you seen, observed, discussed with the people? Are they also completely disconnected themselves because the security framework also applied to them? That's for sure for the UN, but not everybody. Could you say a word on that one? I'm saying that because I'm interested, of course, let's be clear about the solution. Maybe there is 1 or 2 questions around that.
I mean, obviously, our national staff know much better about what goes on and how things work, because, I mean, at the end of the day, when we go home to our compound at night, they go home to their communities, to their houses, and they live in Sanaa or Aden or Ibor or wherever they live, and they very often have family in other parts of the country as well. And they really, I mean, they know what they understand it. They're Yemeni and they understand their own country. I think what very often happens in Yemen, from my experience, how I experienced it, as an international staff member, is that we very often do not listen enough to our national staff. They can tell you things, that they can try and explain to you how things work, or they can tell you, for example, even national staff at UNDSS will privately tell you, oh, the reason why you were denied to go XYZ location is not really true. That analysis is not quite correct. But if we try to override that in a discussion, or if we try to say, publicly that that's not the case, that brings them into trouble. And at the end of the day, they need a job. They're going to be there for the long term. So I think we don't use enough the knowledge and the analysis that national staff have the capability to do. It is also sometimes a bit complicated, because you have to also protect your national staff. People often say, let's send the national staff to the field. No, if the internationals can't go, we will send the national staff. But that's not really fair either, because at the end of the day, if let's say you send them to a distribution to monitor, but if authorities show up to that distribution I mean, your national staff member is in a power dynamic where, you know, they don't necessarily have that power to really push back or speak out. It is your responsibility as an international to kind of take that pressure away. We also make them increasingly be, you know, subject to all the security rules that we are subject to. So we had instances, for example, in the south of the country where we were denied to go as international staff, and so we said, oh well, can we then send, you know, Yemeni staff instead? And UNDSS was like, yeah, but only if you send them in an armored vehicle. And if you want to do a low profile mission, then that also, it doesn't really help the case. I don't know if that answers your question a little bit, if I got to something what you were hoping to hear, but.
Thanks. So yeah, please, all the way in the back. If you could just share your name also and your affiliation, if you'd like.
Hi, my name is Hafsa. I'm a student at the Graduate Institute. I'm also part of the MENA Initiative. So my question is, from your discussion or your talk, we can agree that the humanitarian intervention has failed Yemen. So my question would be, I tend to be very skeptical about foreign aid and humanitarian interventions in general. So my question for you with your expertise is, how are we going to ensure and avoid having this kind of intervention or aid as a tool of coercion of our governments? You know, we've seen this happening before in other countries, or a way of interventionism. They did that in Iraq, you know, before. So and once that idea of we need humanitarian interventionism reinforce the concept of normalizing the pain in the Middle East, I mean, or the chaos in the Middle East. And my third question, or a follow-up question, last but not least, is, do you think we can perhaps successfully create or establish a south-to-south cooperation or regional cooperation in the form of a humanitarian intervention in this kind of situations? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I won't take a question.
No, do you want to take two questions?
I think we have 3 questions now, but I'm happy to collect one more. Yeah. I think you had a question as well. Yeah.
I think you were discussing pushing back against national authorities, and especially where they tend to deny any form of aid. I was wondering if there's some form of agreement amongst the humanitarian actors to maybe show up at more international forums, where I think it's a more balanced part, because it would be way better than negotiating with national authorities regarding delivery of aid. So for example, when matters come up before the UN Security Council, where it's discussed whether the aid can pass through the country. So is there any kind of discussions which goes on, any kind of pushing that way by humanitarian actors?
I will try to answer those questions. With regards to the first question, you ask a difficult one. I think also, and maybe this is also more of a global thing now, things at the end of the day, we have to remember that humanitarian aid, in its essence, is supposed to be short-term and life-saving. Very ideally, it should never really last more than maybe a couple of months or a year, but we have really come in the world at the moment globally into this place where a humanitarian crisis can drag on for decades. As South Sudan has been in the humanitarian crisis since the 90s, since Operation Lifeline Sudan. Yemen is now 7 years, but it's not the first time that it's a crisis. Syria has been going on for years. Afghanistan. And one of the things that is more a systemic issue is that we still continue to deliver humanitarian aid, but with the old models that we have, into a world that is incredibly different today with crises that just last so much longer. And it's very true that we should have a discussion, or there should be a discussion, and this is, for example, where the Triple Nexus tries to go, to have a different way of delivering aid, taking into account how conflicts and crises have changed. I think it would be fantastic if there was more regional support or intervention in places like Yemen. There are some actors who do work there. That said, as I stated, they are part of, the coalition countries, like the Emirati Red Cross did a lot of work, and actually quite good work on the west coast in Yemen. The Saudis have their own relief aids in the country as well, obviously in the south. That kind of, operates separately from the international humanitarian aid system. I'm sorry, I really don't have a good answer to that question. I don't know, Far, if you want to.
Of which one?
What makes the International Humanitarian Aid international?
Sorry?
Why is it international human aid when it's done by the West and when it's not regional? Because you mentioned it's not international human aid. What is international?
No, sorry, if I said that, then that's not what I meant. It is international aid. I said there are more regional initiatives, no, but they are also international, of course, because they come from countries outside of Yemen.
And it's somehow, if you think of the aid as an industry, just like the weapons industry, for a second, you will find that it has its entire cycles, all the way from when the country decides to fund or doesn't fund. It goes all the way down. It's constantly a political decision and the political industry by itself. The threat we have now is because, even as you were explaining at the beginning, from even an Islamic point of view, like aid, the concept of ihsan is a commitment toward the other, is there. And it's gone long time throughout the Islamic world, not just Yemen, internally and domestically and regionally. The idea of ihsan exists. It has even its entire fiqh framework. But now it's, how do you call it? A controlled ihsan in a way, a conditioned one, a used one. That applies, that learns totally from the international systems. When you sign donor, you have a specific, obviously, rules and laws. You shouldn't do it, and you have limitations into it. And a big part of it is also a use of this system. When you look into Dubai today, it's a big logistical hub for aid for the region, even for MSF, actually, not just for the UN, by the way. And it's a war site in Yemen, more or less, Dubai. The idea of thinking of aid also as an industry by itself or some sort of a war tool has developed. And while ideally, of course, it would be good if the region steps up to these problems, not just aid. But I am afraid that so far it's even worse than actually what we see. By the end of the day, there is something when you have an aid from countries that have some sort of parliaments, you can hold them more accountable ultimately and the usage of this aid. That's not the case with the region. We don't have too many parliaments, as we know. So it's hard to, even in the slightest level, make it less political than it already is in many ways.
I would also maybe just like to add that it's very interesting. I think we were talking about it earlier today. Actually, you are beginning to see a little bit of a change, in the traditional donors more recently. And I think, traditional humanitarian aid has come from well-resourced countries, Europe, the US, which has plenty of money, which is why they are traditionally the biggest donors. But I think we were speaking today that you and me, that we are actually seeing more money coming from, Middle Eastern countries into the system.
There's, for example, the UNHCR, right, which you would expect, okay, this is a central pillar of the UN system. But UNHCR increasingly attracts Islamic donations, which are earmarked zakah or sadaqah. And in order to be a channel for zakah and sadaqah, the UNHCR needs to collect fatwas from different sheikhs. So they contact all kinds of different fatwa institutions from different backgrounds. I think for the time being, it's mainly Saudi-based, but I think they're also working on getting a stamp from Al-Sistani. And so there will be a lot of kind of Islamic aid flowing into the UN and being distributed through the UN in the future. Now, the big question, and this is more kind of again like a real research question again, what will this then sort of make the Islamic aid the same thing as the old UN system? Will just be kind of a UN system with an Islamic look, or will there be something profoundly different about this Islamic kind of flow of money. And I'm quite skeptical about there being something genuinely different. I think there is a kind of genuine difference in all kinds of whatever Islamic practices, as there is in kind of like different ways of Christian giving and other kinds of givings on different levels. But once it gets through these big international machinery, then the question is, will it not just reproduce exactly the same thing? So that's kind of also a question back to you on the kind of the hope for a South to South cooperation. I think in today's world that becomes a more complicated question with the increasing amount of wealth and power that comes out of the Arab Gulf, but also of other kind of more multipolar kind of power structures in the world. But I think that's just been carrying us away. I think the last question, did we answer the last question? I didn't fully understand. Would you like on the pushing back?
I think I get your question. You can always interrupt me if I'm not answering your question. There are coordination systems. The way it works is that at the country level, inside of the humanitarian crisis, you will have what's called the humanitarian country team. And you will have representatives from each agency, from every organization in that meeting. And that is kind of the space where humanitarian actors are supposed to come to a joint decision, or a joint standpoint that is agreed upon in a collaborative manner where everybody can get behind, and there's solidarity. And that is where you can then from there present it to authorities or to other people and say, for example, this is the red line. Like, we are willing to deliver aid, but if you keep taxing our trucks at checkpoints, then we're not going to do it. The problem with that is to really enforce that, you really have to stand behind that as a whole. And that is something that in Yemen, for example, unfortunately, we haven't really seen. What you have really seen in Yemen is individual agencies and organizations kind of trying to go on their own or trying to negotiate individually. But once you negotiate individually, you're making things much more complicated for everybody else. And you kind of undermine everybody else. I think a really good example of this was in 2019 when WFP suspended aid in Sanaa over a dispute with the Houthis. Initially, everybody was behind it. No, they're like, we will support this. We agree. We have to draw a red line at some point. We as a humanitarian community, as donors, we will all stand behind it. But very shortly after, all of a sudden, another agency wanted to go and distribute cash in all the areas where WFP had stopped food distributions, which would have completely undermined any effect of holding that red line to do negotiations. And luckily, in the end, they all got resolved internally, but you really have this dynamic in Yemen where people don't have each other's back. So, but it's supposed to exist.
Yes, please in the back, and if you could say your name and affiliation, that'd be great.
I'm Ibrahim from Yemen. I'm a master degree student at the Geneva Center of Humanitarian Action. I have a question for Farea. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all. And it's very good chance for me to see you in face today. Really, I'm so proud of you. I have a question for us as a voiceless young men. I'm coming from Hajjah University, I came to Geneva recently, and then as a voiceless people, like in our country, that really we cannot really express, we cannot really transfer the suffering that we're like facing in our country generally. And as Farea just like mentioned, and like in different interviews that I saw before, that really the warlords are the ones who have the higher word in the world. Okay, and for us, we are the most vulnerable people, and then our voices are not really listened, and we are voiceless. And what are the things that can help us, enable us to really express ourselves and to express and to see, or to transfer the truth and what's going on in the field? Thank you. I'm not sure if you got my question, Farea.
So what can we do more to have more agency for our voices?
Yeah,
right?
I mean, which is the best platform for us to really express the reality and to express what we are really suffering in the ground as vulnerable people.
I don't know if I have an answer for that. But do you want to take more question or?
Is there any more? Yeah, we can take more questions. Do you keep that in mind? Sure. That was a good one. Thanks, Ibrahim. Any more questions in the room? Otherwise, I would go on to read one out from the. Okay, here are a bunch of technical questions from Maria Duncan from the International Rescue Committee. So I think they're quite complex. I might pass them on, some of them on for later, but I will ask the first. So the first is OCHA and all UN lead agencies in Yemen publicly release monthly reach and funding figures. Can you please detail where transparency issues were most apparent? Is it the data collection processes or the data sharing processes? I think it's a great one. I think this is two questions that we can.
Sorry, the last part of the question. Collection or sharing?
So the question is, can you please detail where transparency issues were most apparent? Is it on the data collection process side or on the data sharing kind of, how do you then communicate on the data you've collected? And that's a very good question. And yeah, let's chew on these two questions first and then see how we proceed from here.
Look, in the question of agency and so on, we used to have 22 independent weekly newspapers in Sanaa. So as a young man, if you had 22 points every week, you had a way to publish them in somehow. Now we have 0. And obviously, this is because of the larger dynamics of the war have created, where there is no voices, where there is no voices except the guns, and where 99% of the society are obviously isolated. I like to wake up thinking we at Sana'a Center do some part of this work. Good, try to bring a platform and have voices for Yemen, and I'm sure, and I know there are tons of similar initiatives happening in that level, which is trying to have an ownership over our voices again. But what I think for a while, unfortunately, and this is a brutal realism, is we cannot do much as long as the war continues. And that's why our top priority should remain, whatever the details are, whatever we think politically, where we are from Yemen, should remain ending the war, and ending the war. Because that's the only thing that will give us even more agency when it comes to our own food, our own country, and obviously in many other ways. That is what I think probably will give us overall idea of a country, the idea of waking up into some sort of nation and into some sort of a voice that's yours, or at least that's close to your breath. That doesn't have, and I am afraid that, as I said, I think the only or the main focus, and this might be too general answer, really, it's a stupid answer, end of the war, but no, I think that is the most essential step, and that's something we should never forget. That should remain a goal for us, no matter how ridiculous it seems, to try to stop this war, to try to end this war. Because if that happens, otherwise we will continue remaining in a damage control process, and that's it, with a lot of limitation of what we can do. I hope that's any useful.
Sure. I'll actually make a quick point on this one, which is where I actually would like to say I think it's a responsibility of the humanitarian sector also to ensure that we really listen to the voices of the people who feel that they're not heard. And I think one of the biggest problems in Yemen is that when you do a community visit or you do go to the field, very often you're not there for very long. And so you end up talking to the community representative who doesn't necessarily represent every single person in that community, especially when it comes to women's voices. Very often, those voices are disregarded, or if you're Muhammad Sheen, you're not the community representative doesn't necessarily, represent your view. So I really think, it's a responsibility from us also to really broaden, when we do go to the field, to not just speak to the authorities, to the community representative, but to really speak to the people who are in that community. So for Maria's question, I think what I would like to start by saying, I think that every humanitarian who's either here or on Zoom knows that information sharing globally between humanitarian actors is one of the most difficult things ever. Information is considered power. Nobody wants to share information. Getting information from OCHA, from WFP is a nightmare. It is all about who you know. But this is not just a problem in Yemen. This is a problem globally. That aside, talking about the transparency and the monthly, the issue with the figures that get published on reach, like where you reach or what we deliver as a humanitarian response in Yemen, is that actually, how do I explain this? The figures that get published are about how much aid gets sent from the stores in Sanaa or Aden to go and be delivered. There is very, very little known and very little verification of where that aid ends up, at which distribution point, and what's actually delivered and what is siphoned off and what goes elsewhere. I think we all have to be, honest that when let's say WFP says we fed 8 million people in a month, that is how much food has been sent, but nobody actually really knows where that food has been delivered or not. And then about the data collection itself, in terms of what I think the real problem with the data collection in Yemen is that it's more about what it doesn't say. For example, it will not, very often when you look at the HRPs or methodologies for figures of how data was collected, it will not tell you by who. Or if you know that it's been collected by authorities, for example, that inherent bias is not always taken into account in the analysis of that data. So I think this lack of transparency about the restrictions and the flaws of the data that is collected, so that this is not taken into account in the analysis of that data, I think this is very much a flaw that has, one of the key flaws of the data that has come out during the research. I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. So we reached the end of the official time, but I'm told actually that we could go a little bit over time and take some more questions. There's a bunch of questions and comments on the Zoom that I could read out. But I think we're going to have a reception afterwards. No? No reception afterwards. Okay. So we're going to go 10 minutes over, but I mean, this would be also a moment that if you have to leave, absolutely, don't feel bad about leaving us right now. So again, is there any question here in the room left, or otherwise I would take some more from the Zoom. All right. I would like to go back to a comment that I saw that was quite interesting. Find it. So there was a comment regarding the first question, which was about the national staff. Kamau Wanjohi, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly, he wrote, I think it is also fair to say that the national staff are very afraid of the authorities, especially the Houthis. There are cases where they would rather not get involved because they know when it comes back, they are the only ones that will face the repercussions, them and their families. So I think that's a telling comment. Then we have a comment from Sandy Walton Ellery. Can't right now see her affiliation. She writes, thank you both. This was very compelling. I disagree with Farea on one thing. This kind of report could not be done by the UN or INGOs. It just can't be. But my question is, based on what you found, can you imagine any real improvement with the current structure, organizations, and donors in place? It sounds like there needs to be a complete dismantling of the structure and humanitarian ways of working in order to reconstruct something that actually works.
Sarah puts excellent series of recommendations to the donors, in the report. I cannot say except really refer back to them. And I think this requires among a lot of things, as Sarah says very clearly in the first page of the report, an admission of failure. And to practice that, let me start it myself by saying we at the Sana'a Center also have failed Yemenis by not calling this out since 3 years, by not figuring it out early. It was us buying the UN narrative. This is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Is something we bleed guilty of for not doing our homework enough to actually challenge that on time. That is an important shake-up conversation that needs to happen. And this is a problem. That's one type of mistakes we did, of course, when it comes to the data sharing. That's not the purposeful mistake. What's more problematic is the purposeful data misleading. And that happens in many ways. And for me, obviously, as a researcher, before anything else, it offends me that you think you can lie to me about something. But beyond that, it is destructive. I mean, to go back to basics, lying is not a good idea. You go to hell. And this problem, when it comes, I'll give you a very, very specific example how it backfired even on Yemenis. When a few years ago, we said there was the corona. I think it was, I don't know who was it, one of the big INGOs, or actually all of them by that time, came and they said there is 1 million cholera in Yemen. When there's no way, what on earth and heavens they were on, no way this number was accurate. But every pharmacy in Yemen clinic who wanted some support from the agencies reported even diarrhea as cholera. Similar happened this, also these numbers were exaggerated. Our research economists by that time tried to look at how accurate this claim, and we could not verify it, and we still cannot. Let me tell you one of many million things this have a broad catastrophe. Since that time, since the over-exaggeration of cholera, many countries have stopped buying some of our two most important goods in Yemen, fish and honey. The destruction those INGOs did by overflating numbers to one of Yemen's most important and crucial industries is more harmful than all of their aid in their life together to come into Yemen. As simple as that. This is, and you destroyed an entire local industry by exaggerating a number. You know, forget about this is not, and you're wasting money, but you even went all the way for whatever fundraising or Twitter lines or clicks on Facebook. It's funny, by the way, I was thinking of this. I still go to Sanaa today. Last time I was there in Ramadan, one of my screenshots is you have a UN Facebook pages asking you to donate to Yemenis in Yemen, asking you to donate to the UN who's saving lives in Yemen, in Sanaa. Like you get that a post from the UN asking you to donate to the UN so they help save Yemeni lives. It's entire, and then it tells you, I mean, it's very clearly how this is directed, orchestrated misdata in many possible ways. And that, again, it have, I think, served a lot of people's comfort zones, including the idea that you can just throw money into Yemen, you know? You can just throw, if you're the Gulf, of course, you can do whatever you want as long as you send some aid. I went off a track, I know, but that is a point I wanted to come back to, very specific.
Maybe I can comment quickly. I mean, look, on a global level, I think many of us ask questions every day. No, are the current institutions that we have still relevant and able to deliver, you know, in the way that we should be? Should they be completely overhauled or dismantled? That's a huge conversation. I think it's also unrealistic to think that, you know, we will completely overhaul the entire UN system. But I think what I really want to stress here also is that you can make a huge change in Yemen even by changing little things.
Yes.
Well, I say little things that, you know, can have an immensely positive effect. We can stop using parties to the conflict from gathering data and implementing humanitarian assistance. If we start with that, if we just say, you know, UN agencies, if you continue to use parties to the conflict to deliver your aid, we will not fund you. End of story. That can make a huge beneficial difference to Yemen. The security system, the way the framework works, is the same worldwide. If we can make it work in South Sudan and be present in the smallest corners of South Sudan, if in the time of Mosul, you had people running daily missions to a front line, we can do this in Yemen. That flexibility can be brought into the operation and can be negotiated without having to change the institution or the system. Would it be better if we could change the framework? Of course, but there is room for flexibility within that. And I think there are many things that can be done in Yemen today that could have an immensely positive effect on how aid is delivered. I just wanted to share that.
Great. So we have one. I think we end with one last question, but before that, I need to do a little clarification. Before that, when I ask the question on the data and on the data generation and information sharing, that question I associated it to Maria Duncan, and that was wrong. I'm sorry that I've messed it up. The question was from M. Aleriani. So sorry about this. And here is the last, I think, good question to end today's event. The question comes from Kamau Wanjohi again, and he's wondering to what extent this current ongoing evaluation of the humanitarian response to Yemen, the big kind of evaluation that is happening that you mentioned before, to what extent this evaluation is reaching out to the Sana'a Center or to Yemeni communities in order to get a more complete picture. And sort of to what extent the Sana'a Center does have some leverage in ensuring transparency in this report as it is kind of being drafted. So I think that's more for you, Farah.
We haven't been contacted by any of these agencies. We have had in touch with some UN officials for meetings next week. So we have not so far, which is surprising actually. Yeah, to the interagency. Okay, so clearly, good. So yeah, the UN has spoken then clearly to Sarah, but on that interagency, which I hope actually it is probably the best possible timing of the report. It comes out while this revision is happening, so we're a bit hopeful on that. If they don't listen, we will talk again next year. We are going to do, this is also our next, hopefully work in the next while is we will do more, and this is the problem of the data sharing we have with INGOs, is we will have, so far you cannot really get data easily from INGOs, whether from the UN or others, whether on funding or in data or in anything. One example of that, and that's why we cannot really evaluate if this is worth it or not in many times, is the cost value analysis there. Like if you're sending a bottle of water to Hudaydah, and this bottle ultimately costs $10, is it really costing $10? We don't have generation data about that. INGOs do not like transparency. They have not seen many of this data, especially about this specific aspect. But we will find it. We will work on it, and we will draw some parallels into that, how that works within the usual. Because there is a lack of data, there is a difficult data, there is a purposefully hidden of data, and it's not always a challenge or the issue or the harder difficulty on the ground, as much as there is a purpose of, I would call it, untransparency, and that's for us to look at, I think, more the next few months at the center. We will continue to do that in this level.
One last question from Yves.
Just a follow-up question for you, Farea, and I don't know if I can be as specific as that. We are in a special situation where you talk in the report, Sarah, about a systemic issue, right? We do have the boss of the system, right? Knowing extremely well Yemen, which is rare. Now, humanitarian affair, the IRC, is somebody who has spent a lot of time in Yemen, knows inside out Yemen. And my question to you is, does that make any difference?
Does the fact Martin Griffith is now the head of OCHA?
Yeah, of course. It has a huge influence on the coordination, on the understanding, on the use of data. Not really, just I'm interested. I don't want to be now, you feel free to respond to your question, but it's rare, right? Normally you have somebody who doesn't understand at all what's happening.
Well, I haven't pointed at You want me to go first? I think it's a bit double-sided, to be really honest with you. I think the fact that he knows Yemen very well from having been the special envoy is, yes, good in the sense that he understands the country and the problems, no? But the problem that I have here is that, you know, as is detailed in the report, Martin Griffiths really tried to instrumentalize humanitarian aid to influence the political process. And that was extremely detrimental to humanitarian aid. It caused a lot of problems from you know, from a principles perspective, even on a very practical level, where at some point you had, you know, UNMA fighting humanitarians over space in the data, and humanitarians were asked to leave to give space to the political side. I mean, that's, you know, that's a big problem. And I worry that with his background, and therefore, you know, I'm sure continued interest in the political side of Yemen as he worked on it for so long, that this will continue to influence choices he makes on aid to Yemen. But that's my first opinion.
Let's just say he's doing much better in his current job than his previous one. And I think that's not secret to anyone, and including those who are watching it on Zoom. So let's only continue hoping for that. I know by his nature and his experience on humanitarian issues, Martin is always keen about engaging in debate about specifically humanitarianism, and he might have a shot there, I think, because and I think, yes, and I share your concern that sometimes connecting humanitarianism to political path was not necessary the right call always, or actually paid off. It's a huge gamble. But yeah, let's just wish him the best in his new job. I'm sure he needs it, and especially in New York and difficult America.
Thank you. So with this, we're closing the session. Again, I would like to express a very, very warm thank you to the MENA Initiative for hosting us. So Mohammed, and I think Hafsa, you're also part of this. Thank you very much. Thanks to the Credit Institute. And thanks to the Swiss FDFA for making all this possible. We wouldn't be here otherwise. And to the speakers.
Come on.